Good morning, everybody. It's time for another episode of Notes from the Vicarage. I have a few minutes before I have to get on with the next level of chores, which this morning is going to involve writing several blogs. I'm a little bit behind in my blog writing this morning because I got up an hour later than usual, and so devotion and making breakfast for everybody, making the coffee, getting the laundry done, loading up the trash so Amanda could take it with her to get rid of it, is all has all taken up some time, and I haven't gotten to doing any blogging or vlogging yet. So this is the beginning of those moments. I just came back from the store for my mother, picking up her morning papers and whatnot. And I'm standing in the garden, which is absolutely beautiful this morning. The squirrels are eating at the bird feeder. There is a mourning dove over there. The cardinal has been to visit this morning, and several sparrows. I'm looking forward to hummingbirds this afternoon. I hope it gets warm enough for that. Over the last several days, I've been setting up conversations with people to discuss the situation of our country and the situation of our households and the situation of the church moving into the future. Last night I sat with some friends from another church and had about a 3-hour conversation talking about what they saw as the changes that are coming to the church. We all talk about getting back to normal in the church, and yet I don't think that normal is going to be what was. There's going to be a new normal, a new thing. And I believe that God is doing this new thing and preparing his church for what that new thing requires of us. There's also the idea that within the church, we have to really begin to understand the changes that are coming to our households in a permanent way. As Americans, we're going to have to learn to live differently. As citizens of the world, we are going to have to learn to live differently. And so we had this 3-hour conversation last night about what is going on in our world and how that is going to affect our churches and how we do church and how the church is in the world and how we as Christian individuals in the world live in our individual households. I'm interested to know what some of the changes you think are coming. One of the changes that has happened in my life is that I have become very aware of my need to build strong personal relationships in a network around myself, both here online and also in my personal living. And so I've begun to actually do visitations with people, intentional visitation with people who I'm building relationship with and networking with simply for the purpose of friendship and relationship. I said to my friends last night that before in my ministry, I had time for events and emergencies. And one of the big changes I think that the church has to look at, and certainly I myself as a pastoral individual has to look at, is that I don't or I can't in the future spend as much time worrying about events and emergencies. Emergencies we'll always have, but I have to control the events so that they don't they don't begin to compete with the nature of friendships, networking, and personal relationship. In the end, events don't disciple people. And we aren't called to be an organization or a community that has great events. We're called to be a community who, through its relationships, does discipleship and helps people understand who God is in a bigger way. So relationships are going to be very important going forward for me as a pastor and for the lifestyle of the vicarage here. I've got another visit this afternoon, and we're going to be discussing probably more of that same thing with my friend this afternoon. I think what I want to talk about here is the nature of decisions as they lead to consequences. This came about from a blogging friend of mine named Melanie, and her post, her Share Your World post challenge on her blog, Sparks from a Combustible Mind. She asked the question last week, what is the connection between decisions and consequences? And while the answer to that may seem patently obvious, I think that as Americans or as Western people, we sometimes forget that every decision leads to consequences. And we make decisions without thinking about the consequences, and as a result, we end up with consequences we aren't willing to pay. And so we get very upset when the consequences come due. You know, the idea of reaping what you sow is pretty much a universal law, whether you're a Christian or a Buddhist or a Muslim. The idea that your decisions have consequences plays across the religious and philosophical spheres. And everyone pretty much accepts the fact that you are personally responsible for the consequences you create by your decisions. We understand that as individuals, and we understand that as nations. Though sometimes we don't stop to think about what the consequences are of our actions. But they always come due eventually, and somebody has to pay the bill for the decisions we make. Now, in the days that we're living in right now, we see that as a nation and as individuals, we have made many good decisions, and those good decisions will reap good consequences. We've also, as a nation, debatably made some very bad choices, maybe not so debatably. But bad choices are going to reap bad consequences. But it's far more complicated than that. You see, sometimes we make the best decision we can make, and there are still heavy consequences to pay. I'll give you an example. We were talking about the stimulus checks that every one of us got over the course of the last month or so. Now, that was a decision our government made, and I think it was an absolutely necessary decision. I needed the $1,200 as much as the neighbor across the street needed it. We all needed that money. It was probably a very good decision, but let's not pretend that it doesn't have consequences in a payback in the future. We will all be paying back that $1,200 because the government is us. And the government gets its money from us. So while they forwarded us $1,200, that $1,200 is coming back out of our pocket in raised property taxes, in raised water and sewer taxes. There is a consequence to that. And let's not complain about that when that happens. When our rent goes up because our landlords aren't getting the kickbacks from the city, because the city isn't getting the money from the state government, who isn't getting the money from the federal government because the federal government doesn't have it because they gave it to us in the form of a stimulus check. It was a necessary decision at the time, but it does have a future payback for us that we have to be aware of. I guess this is a big deal because, you know, one of the things we're not trained to do very well is to think about the consequences of our actions. We're used to living out of our emotions. Now, emotions are emotions, and we are certainly free to make decisions based on how we feel. Nevertheless, if we make decisions based solely on how we feel, many times we aren't taking the time to logically think through the consequences that are coming about as a result of our decisions. It feels good in the moment to make a certain decision. But what is the payback for you personally? What is the payback for the people around you? What is the payback for the nation because of the decisions we make as individuals and as communities? We have to make sure that we're making decisions based on more than how it makes us feel in the moment. The rioting, for instance. I'm sure for many of those people, it feels very good in the moment to release their anger, their rage, their pent-up emotion in a series of violent acts. But those acts have consequences. They affect us in ways that we maybe haven't foreseen simply because we're acting so quickly in our emotion. We're allowing our emotions to guide us rather than our hearts and our minds. We have to realize that just because you mistakenly allow your emotions to guide you rather than your logic, your reason, and your compassion, that just because you're making a mistake and just because you're sorry about it later will not mean you escape the consequences of those decisions. Nor will the communities that have been affected escape the consequences of the decisions that individuals made out of a heated heart. One of the things we have to encourage each other to at this time is to remember that there's always something you are going to reap. There's a consequence you're going to reap by what you sow today. Anytime you sow in anger, you are going to reap an angry reaction. Anytime you sow in fear, you're going to reap fear. But if you sow love, if you sow compassion, if you sow forgiveness, you will reap love, compassion, and forgiveness. Oh, that's not how the world works, Pastor Jay. No, that's how God works. And ultimately, we're looking for benefits from his hand, not from this world. If we look to the world for every one of our consequences, then we are going to be sadly disappointed because this world cannot provide us what we need. Only God can do that. And it's time we began sowing into God's kingdom with what he's put inside of our hearts, rather than what the world is trying to put inside of our hearts. This world has nothing to offer us that's of any value. It's the eternal kingdom that we all know lives. Solomon said this: God has set eternity in the hearts of men. We're all aware that there's something beyond this life, even those of us who very strongly might deny it. When we look into the center of our being, we know that there's more beyond this time. There are those who will disagree with that. But what we need to understand is that there's a kingdom beyond this that we need to begin to sowing value into. Jesus said it this way: don't store up for yourself treasures on this earth where moth and rust corrupts, but sow up for yourself treasures in heaven. Begin to sow to the eternal kingdom. And if you do, you will eventually reap a reward. The Apostle Paul said it this way: don't be weary in well-doing, brethren, for you will reap a harvest of reward in due season if you do not faint. Well, I want to thank you for listening this morning. This has been a little bit longer than usual, but it was something that I wanted to say, and I hope that it touches your heart. God bless. Bye now.